Good morning, everybody. I think we have a very important topic this morning. A lot of presentations, but I hope they will be all brief, that we have sufficient time for discussion. My name is Hardy Wogman. I have been a long time ago the first professor in organic agriculture, probably worldwide, at the University of Kassel. Later on, president of a state agency for agriculture rural development, and my latest official employment was being president of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. And now I'm heading the biggest NGO in Germany with regard to nature conservation, animal protection and environment. It's called the German League for Nature, 5.6 million members. And we are presently fighting our not even installed German government because they have departed from the track of being on the track of sustainability. So we had the first demonstration already, although the government is not on Saturday, with 15,000 people in Berlin. Next Saturday, I think we went to 30,000, and a week later, 100,000. Just to tell them it's wrong what you are doing. And just to get us into the topic, I would like very briefly to show you 3 slides just to get us into the situation that we realize how important biodiversity is if we talk about sustainable production. Sustainability is a word where you will get different definitions if you have different people. And I think one of the outcomes should be here that we agree on a certain basis of what we mean by sustainability. And the very first time that was actually expressed was as a global responsibility in 1992 in Rio. Because for the very first time, the world community agreed that protection or conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use at that time, and a fair share of the benefits was actually equal. That was the very first time that everybody said yes, is not only the economic side, it's conservation, sustainable use, and a fair share of the benefits, which we still haven't reached yet at any of the other meetings. And that also means that we have to look at agriculture as one of the main factors influencing biodiversity. In Germany, we have 56% of our area as agriculture, 30% as forest. So that means there we have to concentrate. And if you look at this figure, that until the mid-20th century, so 1950, 1960, we had an increase of biodiversity because of the agricultural practices used at that time. And the sudden decline when agricultural practices changed from before a more or less sustainable system into a high external input system. That was the moment when it really turned down. And if we do business as usual, we will have that situation. So it's time now to say we cannot continue business as usual. And what would be one goal is to maintain the level, and a dream to increase biodiversity again. And even to maintain the level, we had 2 promises. One was in Johannesburg, where the world community didn't say we maintain the level. No, we reduce the decline significantly. So they accepted a decline and said it shouldn't be as rapid as it is. Let's slow it down. And more courageous were the heads of the states of the European Union. They said in 2001, okay, we stopped the loss of biodiversity by 2010. When you started asking in 2008, they said, it's difficult. 2009, they said, we're not going to make it. And then came the political wise answer, but we reached it by 2020. And I'm sure we are not going to reach it by that time. Because what we have to consider, and that's the end of what my introduction is, that we talk about a multifunctional farming, which is actually in the European farming policy. But if you look at the subsidies and everything else, they're not supporting multifunctional farming, because then they would not concentrate on food alone, which has been done so far. And maybe we have to consider if we can really have all the products we want from farming if we just go through the price of the food. Maybe we have to have a different price structure also in agriculture. Because if you want to have all the other benefits just through the price of food, food is going to be very expensive. If you want to have clean water and proper energy production even there, cultural landscape, culture is also an important part. I wonder how we can put that into economic figures. Maybe we cannot have all the factors in economic figures. Biodiversity plays an important role, recreation, and also education. So if we want all that, my question is, can we really just pin it down to the price of one product that is food? Maybe we have to rethink it altogether. That's my introduction. Now we come to the first speaker. And the speaker has also to use his microphone. I'm asking also you to introduce yourself very briefly, that everybody, that I don't say anything wrong, because I have a paper and maybe that's wrong on the paper. So if every speaker introduces himself or herself, well, we are not really properly gender balanced today, I must admit. It's okay, it's up to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Hardy. So I'll introduce one of my talks coming up. My name's Adam van Bergen. I'm an insect ecologist. I do research at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology here in the UK, and I'm based in Edinburgh. And part of my job is also to act as the science coordinator for the UK's Insect Pollinators Initiative, which is a large research consortium funded by multiple agents, and it's aiming to address and understand the causes and consequences of insect pollinator decline, and also try and find some ways through the murk to provide some practical solutions. Here it comes. So that's my title slide gone. Magic, thanks. Let's use keystrokes. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to very briefly outline why pollinators are important. Then I shall move on to describe some of the pressures that are threatening pollinators. And then the bulk of the talk will be on the role of insect pollinators in providing pollination services to crops. I'm just focused on crops today. So why are they important? Well, I think we can say, first off, that a large proportion of wild plant species worldwide have a high level of dependence on animal pollinators for their reproductive success. And as a consequence of that, the wider biodiversity dependent on our plants is also in some way indirectly dependent on insect pollination. In terms of food security, there's been an estimate that about 3/4 of crop species worldwide have some dependence on insect pollination. And although most staple crops are self or wind pollinated, such as cereals, the insect pollinated crops, the various fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds and oils which we utilize, they provide considerable dietary diversity and micronutrients and even proteins and calories, which are important for worldwide human health, and I would say even more important in developing regions where people often rely on crops like beans. And that bullet didn't come up, sorry about that. And there's been some attempts in recent years to value pollination services to crops. Galli et al. in 2009 estimated that the value of pollination services was about 200 billion. And recently in the UK, a regional assessment arrived at the figure of 400 million. Now, it's fair to say that these estimates are somewhat simplistic. They use the sort of dependence of a crop and multiply up by its area, and the later UK assessments come in for some notable criticism itself. So we've only got a rough idea in terms of valuation. And
the question was that was annual.
Pardon? Sorry, it was annual. I didn't hear the question. Yeah, it was annual. Yeah. We've carried out a recent review where we've tried to assess the situation. We've tried to assess the various pressures on pollination. And what we came up with in this paper was that we identified these main classes of pressure that are impacting pollinator biodiversity. And I think the key thing you need to know here really is that while the relative importance of these different pressures may vary in space and time, and it may vary with the species of pollinator in question, I think we can say that in general terms, a pollinator is going to be experiencing not a single impact, but a multifactorial impact, a multiplicity of threats, if you like. And there is some evidence of this emerging now with respect to honeybees and the way they deal with combined impacts of pesticides and disease organisms. And I think as a hypothesis, it's probably true for other insects in the wider world. Now, just to move on to discuss crop pollination services, there are three elements really to the delivery and resilience of pollination services. There's pollinator abundance, which is the mechanism really which is the delivery mechanism via which the pollinator, through visiting a flower, will transport pollen. But we've also got these two other attributes, which are community level attributes, the diversity, the species diversity, or the diversity of functional traits in the community. And these things effectively provide an element of resilience in the pollination system. And all three, I would suggest, are key to sustainable pollination services. Now I'm just going to show you some data from one of the projects in the Insect Pollinators Initiative, which is led by Simon Potts at the University of Reading, and they've been doing over the last 3 years an assessment through survey work, through experimental work and through modelling work on the role of different pollinator species in the UK in terms of its pollination of apples, field beans, strawberries and oilseed rape crops. So this first slide is details an experiment carried out in English apple orchards, and you've got apple fruit sets on the y-axis up there, and across the bottom here you've got the various experimental treatments. We've got branches of apple trees that were bagged to exclude all pollinators. We have an open pollination treatment, which is essentially the natural background levels of pollination in the orchard, and we've got a manipulation where the flowers were bagged and then manually pollinated by researchers with a brush. And you've got two varieties, Gala and Cox. And really all you need to note here is that, first off, this is the proportion that's to do with self-reproduction, and this is the enhancement of yield with the presence of insect pollinators. And then we have this shortfall between the background levels of natural pollination and the manipulated hand pollination. And this is suggestive that in these locations there may actually be a pollination deficit in those regions. This slide really is a different message, is that different pollinators, different crops require different pollinators. It sounds obvious, but actually there's not many quantitative estimates of this. If you look here, you've got field bean crops on the left and oilseed rape or canola crop on the right, and you've got the main groups of pollinators that we're concerned with. It's immediately obvious that the oilseed rape, due to reasons of its flower morphology and its evolutionary history, is able to be pollinated by a whole range of taxa, of different pollinator groups, whereas the field bean is actually heavily dependent on the bumblebee group. So arguably you could suggest that field beans may be more vulnerable to any losses of pollination, the pollinator abundance. And this final slide is going to show you how they've been trying to extrapolate data across the British landscape. And I'll just take a moment to explain this. So what they've done here is they produced, the main figure here is a map of the pollination service across the British landscape for field bean only. This inset is a map of the predicted species richness of wild pollinating bees. And this is derived from nothing to do with the abundance of these insects, but the records of species occurrence across the landscape. I'll come back to that point. And then they've merged this map with the data from agricultural statistics, which in this instance gives the field bean cover. So I'll draw your attention to the legend. Warm colours mean there's a deficit, potentially, and green colours mean there's a sufficient pollinator service provision. So you can see there are some areas of eastern Britain which support large areas of field bean which may be suffering from a deficit in pollination. So my concluding slide really is that I think we can say that pollinator biodiversity in its various forms has a role in crop productivity. From this UK work, we see some potential for suboptimal pollination, at least in apple, and some spatial gaps in the species diversity of crop pollinators in the British landscape. One caveat to those sort of maps, though, is they do require very careful care and interpretation. Reason is they're modelled at a relatively coarse spatial resolution, and of course the process of pollination occurs at very fine scales, the flower scale, and they don't incorporate abundance data. Why? Because in terms of wild pollinators, we don't have any, really. Okay, so we can't account for that. And I think it's fair to say that because of that lack of abundance data, actually, we still don't fully understand the functional relationship between pollinator biodiversity and crop yield, particularly at those sort of scales that are relevant to policy, so from the farm upwards. And in the interest of time, I shall halt there with the concluding slides. And you can get lots more information from that website there, where things like these reports can be downloaded free of charge. And I'll finish. Thank you.
I suggest that we discuss later all the presentations. Is that okay with you? So keep your questions ready for the discussion afterwards. And I would like now to introduce there's a three-person block now from the NGO side, and we are very interested to hear, first of all, RSPB, then BTO, and then Conservation International. And you introduce yourself, please. Again.
Thank you very much, Hardy. While we're setting up, I'll just give some background. My name's Mike Clark. I'm RSPB's Chief Executive. And for some of our international visitors here, just by way of background, we're the UK's largest nature conservation charity. We work in a global partnership with BirdLife International that spans 112 other countries, civil society organisations across all of those countries. The largest global partnership effectively is the civil society voice for the CBD, for biological diversity. And I want to really just come into my talk by explaining why for about the last 25 years RSPB has seen the issues around the externalities, not just of agriculture, but a whole series of land use systems, as absolutely being of strategic importance. And I'll just briefly explain where we're coming from, but then I want to look on to the theme of this conference, which is around true cost accounting, the power we see that has, but also then to start looking at how we go from principle into practice, and leave you with a few thoughts on that. Just get controls here. So I want to start with, I rather fear we're going to hear a lot of this over the next few days. So I'm going to be very brief, and I don't particularly want to dwell on the depressing, but I think we do need to scope the problem and where we come from on that. This year, in partnership with about 24 other organisations in the UK, we produced the State of Nature, which was, I guess, certainly for the UK, the most comprehensive ever assessment of the state of biodiversity, and I suspect one of the most comprehensive of any country in the world. 5% of all the terrestrial biodiversity was assessed, and the headlines in this are that 60% of those species are in decline, and 10% are endangered with extinction and are continuing to decline. And this essentially reflects a systemic process underway, which is around trophic degradation and the dismantling of food webs. One of the major drivers of that systemic change is agriculture. In fact, it's the dominant driver of that change. And here you've got a graph which shows the relationship, and it's a highly correlated relationship between agricultural intensification over the last few decades and the decline in an index of farmland birds. But this is repeated across the whole of nature. 1% per annum of the seed bank is in decline. The total volume of seed bank is in decline. 74% of nearly 100 plants that bumblebees prefer to forage on, 74% of those species are declining, 64% decrease in carabid beetle species, 74% in farmland moths, and we're seeing declines in bats. That there's strong suggestions one of the linkages is through to avermectins in cattle management. And the point about all of this, and really just the point to establish here, is that biodiversity and the decline is really an indicator of some of the very major externalities around our farming system. And we're very pleased to be supporting this whole conference, because I think this is about, and this conference is part of creating a new narrative for what is currently a broken food system. So we're very pleased to be here with this. And I really want to just then move on to look a bit more detail the nature of these externalities and some of the asymmetry there is in terms of costs. So I'm going to spend a few moments now on the water cycle. Most of you would be probably aware that from the late 1980s, public water supply and sewage treatment was removed from the state sector into the private sector. Since that time, the cost to the water industry of the main environmental impacts from agriculture, which is nutrients, not particularly nitrogen, pesticides, and cryptosporidium, which is a very nasty single cell bug that causes major health problems, really very serious health problems. The total cost to the water industry of cleaning that up so far has been £1.5 billion. That's the total period. That's capital costs over that period. Yeah, actually hold it, because that is a capital cost. That excludes the operating costs and the carbon emissions of the plant that's been set up to treat those. Under the Water Framework Directive, further clean-up is required, and approximately a third of the problem comes from agriculture, and a third of the problem comes from, if you like, water industry, the water we're consuming and then excreting, and the clean up from that. So broadly, in terms of contribution of cost there, you've got a third borne by each of those sectors. In terms of where the cost is met, 88% of that cost, total cost, is met by the water industry versus the third they contribute. The third of the agricultural cost, the amount that's met by agriculture is 0.1%. And this is set alongside, per annum, £2 billion worth of subsidies going into the agricultural system, which goes back to your capital revenue point a moment ago. So I just really wanted those statistics, just to give you an idea of the huge structural asymmetries that there are, even when you start capturing the costs of some of these externalities. Which is why we certainly see the approach of trying to get a handle on this in terms of true cost accounting as so crucial. And of course, the Millennium Ecosystem and the Natural Ecosystem Assessment in this country are starting to make the links in terms of understanding the life support systems and how you put the two together. I really want to just make the point, this is, in a way, the concept is not new. Gilbert White, who is probably, perhaps, arguably the first natural historian in the UK in 1789, in fact, we're kind of suitable location for this kind of this point. He wrote about the nature economy, and he was studying earthworms and the role at that time, a lot of exploration into land productivity. So the idea has been there a long while, but what we're starting to get, I think, are two things are coming together. First of all, economic techniques for valuing non-market goods, public goods, coupled with then, I think we're starting to reach a more mature point of being able to define ecosystem services, the life support systems. Those two things combined, I think, are now creating a very powerful tool. And strategically, for RSPB, we see this as absolutely one of the central parts of our strategy in terms of, and indeed as part of global partnerships, what should the response be to the pressures on the state of nature. And I have to say that, you'd expect perhaps a nature conservation organisation to say this. Anybody, if you're aware of the principles of responsible investment, UN body or driven body looking at global capitalism and how those markets operate. And the estimate is that 50% of corporate earnings worldwide are at risk due to external environmental externalities. The operational risk, the investment risk of the corporate sector is hugely increasingly bound up with environmental risk, and there's a big reason why I should be looking at this if you're from the corporate sector as well as from a nature conservation organisation like me. So I briefly want to look at two quick examples now as to how you start getting a handle on this problem. And both of these are out of the water theme. And the first of these is work that's been going on under a very regulated price system that we have here in the UK, which has meant that there's been a shift to start, rather than having end-of-pipe chemical treatment plants, looking at how you go upstream and improve the management of the catchment to take away some of the problem. And up in the uplands of the UK, it provides 80% of all our drinking water. And we started just over 10 years ago with some small-scale schemes when you look at the scale of investment. One particular project, RSPB working with United Utilities, has led to 40,000 hectares, so what's that, about 100,000 acres of land in the uplands, where essentially we've had money from the water customer through water pricing regulation being put alongside our agri-environment support packages that come from government to encourage something like 70 farm businesses to restructure, reduce their stocking densities by 30%, plant 1.5 million trees, block up about 100 kilometres of ditches, and all of this is then leading to increased savings. The level of investment that went on there was about a £20 million capital package. It's saving £2.3 million operating costs per year, and importantly taking away some significant risks like the public health risk around Cryptosporidium. Over this period, we've now seen this grow to the extent that this current pricing round that's about to, in fact, the companies lodged their plans yesterday, and we're expecting to see about 300 plans coming through, and maybe in the order of about £500 million worth of investment going into this approach now. And indeed, Wessex Water, one of our major water companies, they're geographically based, actually sees this approach as the major way going forward it's going to be able to keep its water bills down. And water bills and the cost of living is a hot topic in the UK at the moment. So that's quite a good example of, from a very regulated approach, to how you can start putting some benefits so that farm land managers are actually being rewarded for positive outputs rather than negative outputs of the system beyond their food production. I just briefly want to look at another example, which is from Poole Harbour on the south coast of the UK. Very important site in biologically. It's part of Europe's Natura 2000 site network. The nitrogen load going into Poole Harbour is massively over what the environmental limits will tolerate, so it's about 2,200 tonnes per year. That's about 550 tonnes of nitrogen too much per year. 83% of that comes from agriculture. The rest comes from sewage linked to economic development, housing and so on. At the moment, because the thresholds are exceeded, about 1/6 of the total wetland area is now covered by dense algal mats. There is essentially a constraint now on economic development. So the externalities here are not just environmental, they're knocking on into the rest of the economy. And in order to be able to allow local sub-regional economic development plans to go ahead, we have to find a way of bringing down the inputs into the system. Again, Wessex Water, as it happens, the water companies through the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive already reduced the sewage inputs by half. But the regulations, nitrate regulations around the agricultural inputs are simply not sufficient to get a handle on this. Okay, thank you. And just to wrap that up, essentially, I'll just wrap this bit up and I'll just skip over a few other points. There's been a voluntary approach sought whereby the local authorities responsible for economic development will channel some of their monies through the planning process into farmers, in order to pay them to take different land use approach. This is a voluntary approach. So far this has failed to deliver, and the reasons are that first of all, from the local authority point of view, they simply feel this is paying the polluter, and they have some deep principle problems with that. Second, from a farming point of view, the long-term agreements involve a high degree of risk, and the level of financial reward they need essentially means it's cheaper to buy the land out. And then thirdly, when you speak to the public, they're outraged to understand that actually there is this asymmetry in the first place, and there should be much stronger what's called cross-compliance in the UK and in Europe, and greater enforcement. So the interesting example of that is two examples where we've got a very mature regulatory environment with measures happening, a more immature environment where at the moment, we're not making progress, even though we can see there might be a way forward. And I'm just going to finish by simply, I'm going to make a few other points very, very quickly. These are around some of the, so I just want to make a point. Natural capital, true cost accounting, a very powerful tool and technique. It has its limits. First of all, we've got a lot to put into practice. Second, there are trade-offs between, in this case, flood resource management and biodiversity, which means that you can't always get a win-win. I'll skip over the next slide. Other limitations to a economic model are, first of all, cultural services, is where the NEA is at its, I'd say, is at its limits at the moment. As mentioned earlier about the health and well-being, how do you cost that? There's also the existence value. We have a big campaign on albatrosses. 2 species currently are now being saved by measures put on long lining, 100-kilometre lines. How do you stop them hooking albatrosses and other seabirds? How do you cost the value people put to that? And I think my point finally is to say 3 key things. 1, true cost accounting is a powerful tool. 2, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And 3, market failure and market building mean we still need to have strong regulation and incentive measures. Thank you.
I always have this question when I listen to this. It all seems to fit into our present economic model of linear growth. maybe we should question that as well to see where the limits are then. Okay, the next speaker from the British Trust of Ornithology. So we have the bird people here at the moment. Andy Clements, and please introduce yourself.
I will. Thank you very much.
And what's the time?
I certainly will. I won't keep you for more than about 5 minutes. My name's Andy Clements. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Trust for Ornithology. We're a UK-based organisation, increasingly international. Our purpose in life is to provide the data upon which decisions can be made, evidence-based decisions can be made, and predominantly we use, it should say Sustainable Food Trust. Yeah. So I just want to give you some examples from our data. And in a sense, I kind of follow the speaker from CEH, going back down to the micro level. Mike was usefully up at the macro level. And I just want to illustrate two things for you when the slides come up. There we go. Thank you very much. So this is the Farmland Bird Index. A lot of people in the UK will be very familiar with this. It shows the decline over a 40-year period or so. What's interesting about this slide is that the overall decline is marked. If you take generalists out, birds like wood pigeons, things like that, and look at specialist farmland birds, the decline is even more marked. That's kind of the context, if you like. One of the things we heard about pollinators is that it's pretty tricky to separate out the impacts of different pressures on the state. What this slide shows is the population index for skylark on farmland matched with a range of modelled aspects to do with different pressures. And it shows that when you have land use in the model, either on its own or with climate change, that mimics the population change quite markedly. But if you take the one for land use for climate on its own, it's flat, and it really demonstrates nicely how you can begin to separate out these pressures. And it has been common to talk about climate change as one of the things that's driving a lot of these changes. And we have to remember, of course, that land use is very important. We've just published the Bird Atlas, which is the complete stocktake of Britain's and Ireland's birds every 20 years or so, 19 million records. And what this slide says is that while there are still declines, there are changes. And the most marked declines have been in the period, the first period of a 40-year slot between 1970 and 1990. And although there are some declines still, things have levelled out, but there hasn't been any recovery. That's an important point I want to come back to in a moment at the end. One of the things we've been able to do with bird data, which we can't yet do with pollinators, is map abundance change. So these maps show you the changes in relative abundance of species across the UK. And so if you look at all our migrants together, in the southeast of England, the blue squares are where the numbers of these birds are declining markedly. In the north and west, things are looking a bit better for that group of species. But this southeast-northwest thing is repeated across a range of different species groups. Here are waders. Obviously, there's a big problem in southwest Scotland. But you can see here, this is the RSPB reserve of the Ouse Washes in red, where, you know, that's important because we understand how to look after these birds at a micro scale, at a protected area scale. But what we don't understand is what's going on in the wider countryside. And this is illustrated here, where this is the breeding season range changes for all species across the UK on the map here. You can see that declines in farmland are still going on, less so in the second 20-year period than in the first. But what this map shows is for every bird species in Britain, the pattern is the same. In the southeast, things are not good, and in the northwest, perhaps they're slightly better. And there's no better illustration of that than one species here, the turtle dove. The RSPB has a very strong program to recover the turtle dove. You can see on the left here, the black down arrows are where the range of this species has changed, where the species was before and it is no longer. So it's retracting its range into the southeast. But look at the extent to which the numbers are going down in the southeast of England. The 2 points I want to make as I finish are, first of all, the fact that 20 years ago we were seeing really dramatic declines and they're not quite as bad now, I think means we have to change the nature of the conversation we have with farmers. Because whenever you talk about farmland biodiversity declines, farmers are on the back foot and it's a very tricky conversation. So I think we need to change that. My second point, it goes to what was said about pollinators. We ought to do some research. And I think, I suspect that when we discover the ways in which we can measure abundance change of invertebrates, which predominantly are the food of these species in southeast England, we'll find very dramatic differences between what's going on in this part of the country and what's going on there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And now we have the speaker from Conservation International, one of the very big organizations worldwide, and it's Sandy Andelman, and please introduce yourself. Think about the time.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Yeah. Hi, I'm Sandy Andelman, and I'm the Chief Scientist at Conservation International, and I also have another hat as Executive Director of Vital Signs. And Vital Signs is an effort really to collect the data that we need in order to actually do true cost accounting for agriculture. And my dream is really to cover the planet with this kind of data. We've started in Africa, and this grew out of a challenge from the Gates Foundation. We had gone to the Gates Foundation, which is the world's largest private foundation, and one of their types of investments is in agricultural development. And we're asking them, what are the environmental impacts of the foundation's investments in agricultural development? And they didn't have the data. And through a conversation with them, they challenged us to produce the data, and we said, well, give us the money, and we'll produce the data. So I'm going to show you a very short 2.5-minute video that shows you how we're starting to do this in 5 countries in Africa, and then I'll show you what we're doing with the data very quickly. So this is Tanzania. So what we're really trying to do is produce the measurements both on the ground, so whether it's household surveys that look at income, assets, nutrition, health, or measurements that you saw on the ground, or remotely sensed measurements, in order to be able to calculate these externalities and also calculate the benefits. And I just want to show you just 2 slides of what we're doing with this data. So all the data are freely available for the scientists who want the data. But what we really want to do is change decision making and produce the kind of evidence-based decision making that we just heard about. So how do I can't see. There should be a play. Oh, is this PowerPoint? It's, there should be a play mode. I don't know why you don't have the. Maybe I could, just in the interest of time.
There's a view slideshow.
View as single page.
Something, it's not in Keynote, it's just.
Down the bottom, next to the bottom slideshow.
Yeah, there you go.
In that drop down.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want, this is an example from Tanzania where smallholder farmers are earning on average $183 a year from their food production, but they're using another $204 per year of benefits that they receive free from nature. So they're actually getting more, in a sense, from nature than they are from their farm production. So this doesn't advance. Oh, okay. This is a. All right, so what we're doing is we've created a transparent system that goes from these measurements to a set of high-level decision support indicators that are really intended to influence decision-making. For example, decisions on the $3 billion of investments that have been committed by the G8 New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. So this is a public-private partnership of about 50 multinational food-related corporations and G8 governments. Anyway, I just want to show you, you don't really need to worry. I don't want you to see exactly what's in all of these boxes, but basically going from all the rectangles and triangles, which are the actual measurements, the raw data, through a set of analytical indices to come up with a measure of biodiversity security, a biodiversity security index. And it's transparent in the sense if you don't like the index or if you want to use the data for something else, everything's available. And then taking that and feeding it in to get a measure of the sustainability of agricultural production. So in essence, looking at the trade-offs between over here, how much land is being converted from natural ecosystems to agricultural production, what's the intensity of inputs, how efficient are the yields, and then for a given level of yield, what are the trade-offs with respect to biodiversity loss per unit area of production, climate forcing, water use, nutrition, etc. So I think this is really the basis, the data, and the system for accounting for the true cost of agriculture. And it's starting to work in the first 3 countries in Africa, and I think if we can do it in Africa, we should be able to do it everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we are coming to the last presentation. From somebody who came a very long way away from here. I think you have the longest. Please introduce yourself. And
I'm Caroline Saunders, Lincoln University, New Zealand. Thank you so much for the invite here. I left the UK about 20 years ago to go and live and work in New Zealand, but it was my passion before I left, and what I was working on just gels with what you're doing now, which was the transformation of the common agricultural policy from providing incentives just to increase production, more food, more milk, more grass, more cows, into changing the policy to ag-environment schemes, and we looked a lot about how to design those and get the optimum amount. It's a shame it's not sort of got a bit further than that. Another passion I have is that we talked earlier about what's economics. Economics is about maximising well-being, welfare, growth. Let's redefine growth, and we look at the environmental, economic, social and cultural, and I've sort of panicked and knocked a load of my slides out, you'll be pleased to hear, and one of those is actually the methodologies we're doing in defining cultural, because in New Zealand in particular the indigenous culture is important. Okay, in valuing biodiversity, just a bit of context, we get a bit of mix with our language. We've got natural capital, that there's quite a lot of methodologies, valuing, we can value the stacks of trees and things like that, that's the stocks. Ecosystem services, as you've said, and the honeybees are a wonderful example, that we're beginning to try and put together metrics of valuing these. Economically, it's not that difficult, famous last word, and a lot of that is interacting, working with scientists, but it's still valuing use values. And so I want to sort of go through those relatively quickly and perhaps slow down a little bit about the non-market valuation techniques, and that not just incorporate the use, but all the non-use, your albatrosses or whatever. So let's see how we go. Forgive me, so if you give me a 5-minute warning?
yes.
Thank you. 2 slides, just a bit of New Zealand context that may or may not be relevant. New Zealand, as you probably know, its economy is very much based on agricultural exports and tourism exports, related to land, the biological economy we tend to call it. A third of the land is under conservation estate, and when I first went to New Zealand I said, hey guys, what do you do on your agricultural land for environment? And they said, oh, go away, Caroline. A third of our land is a conservation estate, we don't care. So my passion in New Zealand over the last 20 years has been trying to make them care, and amongst others, and I must admit the attitudes are much different now. The other thing to remember about New Zealand is it's got a pretty unique biodiversity. And so there's a big tension between indigenous biodiversity and exotic biodiversity. So when I'm talking to the scientists, they actually don't think in the terms that we do within Europe about multifunctionality in land and biodiversity on farmed land. And so there's a little bit of tension there, because of course the indigenous biodiversity has been decimated by the introduction of species. So we've got bird populations declining, and most amazing birds that have no fear of humans or other animals, so rats and stoats and that one. So the understanding of multifunctionality, as we've just heard earlier, is quite low. And the other big thing is there's no subsidies. So we talk about these positive externalities and giving subsidies to the US, Europe and maybe other countries, but that's just off the radar screen in New Zealand. There's no way one it could afford it or it's politically acceptable. And to be honest, even for biodiversity protection. I've just said we've got the debate around indigenous biodiversity and whether any biodiversity is a value of land. Some scientists, have great debates with the scientists. Some say anything under 20% of the farmed area, it's not really worth it. Putting that aside, there's huge impacts or changes in New Zealand. They've discovered nitrogen fertiliser and dairy cows. And so some of the slides you saw about water quality are beginning to apply to New Zealand. So we're getting quite concerned about the aquatic biodiversity and putting nitrate limits and policies coming in regulation to help deal with that. And then there's lots of loss of remnant bush. So a third of the land might be in conservation estate, but then there's also lowland bush, and trying to find policies to protect that and keep that there. Another big issue that's not just New Zealand, but and I think you introduced that, was how do we measure biodiversity? And there's a lot of literature, and we're looking now, what is a biodiversity footprint? What's a biodiversity offset? And so we've got a lot of literature and looking about that across the world, and I think that's a debate that needs to go on. Biggest problem in New Zealand are the weeds and pests, possums and pines, so the exotic species coming in and destroying this indigenous biodiversity. Okay, so how do we measure biodiversity? What are the kind of ways that an economist can bring to it, or to give a value proposition for biodiversity, as you have to in New Zealand? One is, I think we've heard about the pollinators, the reduction in operating expenses, ecosystem services, so going out and valuing what is the difference about the honeybees, how do the honeybees provide these services, what happens if you don't have them, and again an issue in New Zealand because you have the varroa mite, you've got destruction of hives. Save costs from extreme events, and I see that internationally by having some biodiversity mangroves. You've got an erosion planting, so we're looking more and more extreme events with climate change, that the benefits of these ecosystem services can be evaluated for that. And we've just done some work on the impacts of climate change and increased floods and droughts, and how we could reduce the impact of those. A more difficult one is the benefits from increased productivity, and we're looking at beneficial species here, cross species. So to look at how one can, through biodiversity, introduce beneficial insects, and that's pretty much in its infancy. It's a bit hard to calculate some values from that. None of those require, they're well-established economic techniques that we can use. Another passion I've got is, one of the ones in New Zealand, is to give a value proposition to deliver these goods, is increase market premiums through market returns from premium prices by selling on some of these attributes, and then non-market valuation techniques. One of my favourites here is the market access, and I go around and talk a lot to the sectors, and Zespri in particular we work with, and they were saying, how do we stay ahead of the game in marketing? And I said fantails. Ponds, the RSPB go nuts for a pantail. These are the amazing birds that fly around you. And the Zespri guy went, well, that's amazing. You look on their marketing, and I didn't get a penny, they're marketing on fantails. Saying that, we had land care, and we went into the orchards to make sure that the fantails were there and being maintained, so we weren't greenwashing. I've had my 5. Yep, cool. And that. A bit of self-indulgence here very quickly is that if I go into New Zealand in particular, say, we'll feed the world, never mind, you're too pond-based, Caroline. Nobody cares about some of these animal welfare, water, greenhouse gases, biodiversity attributes. So we've done a couple of studies and another study out there, and I just want to stress, this isn't just a problem of the UK. These are the willingness to pay by these countries, China and India, for these attributes. And you look at the values compared to the UK, those countries care. They care deeply. Wow. And, that's just, when I show that to the frontieres of the world, the little eyes pop out. So we're digging into that, different reasons. Biodiversity, it said ecosystem service. These are some of the examples that we've been looking at in New Zealand, difficult to find values for. Very quickly, we're now into non-market valuation, which has got a very checkered history. And I was involved in the first study in England that looked at valuing the South Downs and the Somerset Levels and Moors to get funding off MAF. And it actually helped because MAF go to Treasury to get the funding. The technique's come a long way since then. We're working in New Zealand to get this technique populated so that biodiversity can go around the cabinet table and talk to Treasury. And we're having uphill task, but we're achieving it, populating our ministries with that. New technique is choice modelling. It, as I said, it comes steps on from the old contingent valuation. Costanza's work, and he comes out to New Zealand, fantastic bloke, didn't help our policymakers by saying, oh, the ecosystems in the world are worth 26 billion. It's great. I'm not saying I disagree with him, but what the policymakers need to know it is in some way within their environment that they can change. So we're putting it alongside how much would you put that against health? How much would you put against your budget for education? And so by doing that, we're improving the accuracy. And I've learnt to hide slides, believe you me, but here's one quick example where we've just done the impacts of irrigation, cultural environment, and we've got a cultural index, and fascinating at the end, to compensate for irrigation, for the environmental impacts in New Zealand, you should be paying that compared to the benefit of that. So, you know, that's the kind of externality cost that we're going to put out there for the, I'm sorry, my hiding slide didn't work. I did honestly, I was going to put 5, I panicked, I'll hide these things. Issues with the technique, it's a very costly technique. We have to learn to transfer benefits between. We've got to make sure it's comparison with real policy alternatives, payment vehicle realistic. But, you know, we often get back, people actually won't pay what they say they pay in these studies. In fact, studies show they actually pay more. Okay, so they actually go on more. One of the key issues, I'm obviously not going to go through all this because I'm going to get cut off any second now, quite rightly, is how do we link this with science? We need science to really give us the genuine alternatives that are out there, and then it's up to us to communicate those with the public and then get the public around that in a meaningful way. So the scientists in New Zealand go absolutely nuts for a giant snail like this. But if I present that to the public, they might not quite see it in the same value. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have not very much time left for discussion, so I would rather than going into each of the presentations, do something which Patrick asked me to do and discuss. He said, sharing thoughts about existing and potential mechanisms, including policy and market options for intensivizing farming systems which deliver ecological benefits. So maybe we should, unless you have an urgent question with regard to the presentations for clarification, then I would rather like to talk about this aspect. What actually can we do from here? Because I give you one example. In Germany, since the 70s, we have produced data. We have produced data. And we thought even more data will convince politicians, and no. Emotions is where we got suddenly a movement going. And I give you just one quick example how I do it with my students. I show them very nice landscapes and very bad landscapes. Admittedly, I manipulate with music. The bad one has bad music, the nice has nice music. And then I ask them to say, which one would you like? They say, this one. I said, okay, write me down your shopping pattern. What do you buy? How do you shop? Sorry, guys, nobody's going to get this. And then we sit down and create a shopping basket that we get this landscape with the way we are shopping. And that is a first awakening for those, oh, there is already the decision made what kind of landscape we get afterwards. And that was much more than producing more data. But let's see now what we can do with all the knowledge we have around here, maybe to find the right way. How can we influence policymakers? How can we influence industry? And how we can involve civil society? That's very important. I have the first, I give you this because they need it for recording. Maybe you introduce yourself briefly.
Okay, Tara Garnett, Food Climate Research Network at the University of Oxford. Really interesting presentations, very frightening slides showing the decline in biodiversity. But my question is really the balance between on and off farm biodiversity and how you make decisions and make sensible trade-offs where they exist that can be incorporated into the processes of accounting that reflect those true costs, because it strikes me that you can either carry on as usual or you can intensify production in ways that spare biodiversity outside agricultural land, or you can extensify and take up further land use and erode off-farm biodiversity, or you can eat a bit less, particularly eat fewer resource-intensive foods, and then you can get a certain amount of win-wins in less intensive agricultural production while maintaining off-farm biodiversity. But for that, I think we need to think really carefully about how we incorporate those in ways that are equitable for populations outside the US and North America, where more food is actually needed.
Before I pass on, that's better. Yes, and I pass it on to Patrick. But just the questions. We are producing actually at the moment enough food for 11 billion people. So if we reach 9.6, do we need to produce for 15 billion people? Or couldn't we finally come to the point that we produce enough for everybody and distribute it evenly? Patrick.
I want to address the point you made about the politics of how we can bring about change. And I want to refer to a conversation which I heard 20 years ago between the then Chief Executive of RSPB, Sir Graham Wynne, and the then President of the National Farmers Union, Sir Simon Gourlay, at a private meeting in the presence of the Prince of Wales, which was called from a group called the Agricultural Reform Group, and the slogan was farmers and environmentalists working together. And the conversation went something like this, probably not the exact words. Simon Gourlay to Graham Wynne: I don't mind what you tell me to do on the edges of my farmed area, but just don't tell me what to do on the main cropped parts. And I think that there was a deal done there. It wasn't that there wasn't a little bit of argument and there hasn't been some accommodation by farmers, but basically the deal is that until now, the nature conservation organizations have respected the right of farmers to do what they want to do in the main cropped area in return for quite a lot of influence through the agri-environment schemes on the 5, 10, 15% of the margins. And I think what Mike's just said is an incredible thing. We need a new narrative. And I want to ask, because I think only with the combined membership of the nature conservation organizations will we have the political clout to bring about change. So that's my plea to the conservation organizations, who have huge power.
Do you want to reply to this?
Yeah, I'll stand up. I mean, I think, just go back a step. It seems to me, of many elements that are needed, two goals, and certainly I think if Dieter Helm from the Natural Capital Committee, which has been established in the UK, interestingly established to report to the Treasury, but frankly there's not much sign that it's coming out the other end in terms of what the Treasury's hearing. But the two key aims are, first of all, how you get into the government's impact assessment, the cost-benefit assessment of policy mechanisms, the Green Book, how you build true cost accounting into that. And the other one are international accounting standards for corporates. So those are two big strategic aims. And so I'm broadening this beyond farming, but embedded in that, a lot of the big signals come out of some of those policy measures for CAP. And within all of that, I think there's this big issue of complexity. So when we do some focus group work, that little example I gave in Poole Harbour, the public cannot believe these asymmetries. Why are they there? They are so complex. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily had a that kind of arrangement over the last 20 years of kind of where we can comment or not. I think this is more about how you get exposed the underlying simple patterns, but to get to them, you've got to remove a lot of technicality and complexity to expose those. And then I think we're into societal choices. And we bring a societal choice around believing that nature is important to people's humanity at the bottom line of it all. There's a whole range of other choices about equity here, and I think it's how we create that conversation.
But the thing I didn't put in my point was that my proposition is the real damage is being done in the cropped area. Yes. It's not, we're mitigating around the edges. And that's my question.
Okay, I start with you here, and then there, and then maybe we run out of time.
Okay.
But please be brief.
Hi, my name's Lee Marinoff. I'm very involved in politics in the United States, and I also run a small, diverse family farm. And one thing I can say about our Senate in the U.S. They are not even in the conversation. They don't address this. They're not interested in this. And I don't know how we subvert that, but we've really been trying. It doesn't seem to be taking hold. However, on the small, diverse family farms, we have so many young people. They are willing to start the transition. They really, really want to reframe the questions. They are thinking of all the things that the speakers today have been talking about. And so I would say, let's forget the politicians for now, and let's get the 3 million young farmers we need in America on our farms, and you need here as well. And let's start with education. Let's start with education around 20-year-olds to 25-year-olds, because they get it, and let them then go to their parents, who are the senators, and work that way. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, but we might have to change the system of education at the same time, because at the moment it goes in one direction, and maybe we have to change that as well.
Thank you. Peter Nixon National Trust, which is a quite large conservation organisation in the UK, and picking up Patrick's point, and the last speakers, absolutely right. We've got to work together, all conservation organisations, and this is far too important for any worries about turf or identity or brand. There's a real common call to arms out there. And we need to operate on a landscape scale in two respects, I'd suggest. One, physically, in terms of large scale, is important for nature, we all know that. But actually, picking up on the point the lady has just made, we need to reconnect people with nature. And it's not just the young farmers, critical though those are, it's all young people. There is a massive disconnection between young people and the land and nature. And we have to connect to them emotionally, as you were saying, Hardy. You've got to find a way of making that connection, and it's not in data speak and it's not in political speak. And I think that's probably the biggest task for us.
Thanks. I just wanted to come back to your remark about data, because I agree with you that emotions are very important. But if you want to change businesses, you have to have data. So, for example, I serve on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on food security, and recently met with the private sector board members of the World Economic Forum. And when we asked them, what's the limiting factor for you to change your value chains, it's data. Because they operate on the principle, you can't manage what you don't measure. So I do think there's a role for data. And the other example of where data is important, there's a statistic that's going around that, about there's a 30% waste in the food chain, and that we could feed more people if we just eliminated waste. So our council, the World Economic Forum, which has experts from all over the world, tried to actually trace back the source of that statistic. And you can't. You can get back to one small study that was done in this one place in 1 year, but in reality, it's just a myth. So I just want to make the case again for data.
Yes, a question about myth. I'm actually here at this meeting and realize that the connection to the German-speaking world is not there. Many of the things that have been said today, we have studies on, we have done research. Future of Food, we have an organization, we have an online journal, we have students' organizations, but it seems that the barrier is nobody reads German literature or German data. Because we have a study in Germany done by our German federal government about this 30% loss and where it occurs. And interestingly, I do with my students, international students, a study, and the best data we got was from Great Britain. And we are going to do on 4 commodities now, because I asked the industry the question, hey, listen, are you prepared to have 30% less turnover? Are you ready with your economic model? And we are trying now with 4 commodities in Britain to find out what does it mean for import, export, processing industry, marketing industry, if you reduce it by 10%, 20%, and see what happens then. But there is some data. No question we need data, but data alone is not the answer. And we need action then from all various areas. Absolutely important. Young farmers, yes. we have unfortunately the situation that in many Central European countries, young people don't want to become farmers anymore. That's our big problem now. And we really have to make it interesting for them now to say, hey, listen, it's not just producing food. It's more than that, what you're doing for society. That's our important message at the moment. Otherwise, we lose farmers, right and left. And then we have companies buying that land from Holland, producing 40,000 pigs in one area and 150,000 slaughters, 150,000 chickens a day. That's what the consequence is. And so we need these farmers, absolutely.
My name's Abby Bunker. I'm Head of Agriculture Policy at the RSPB. Patrick, I heard you speak actually at the National Farming Union conference a couple of years ago. You were on the platform with Peter Kendall and made a very, very rational, very compelling call for us not to be distracted by ideological differences and barriers, that in actual fact we needed to get rid of that barrier between organic and conventional. Just remove it and start working together to find practical, meaningful, effective ways and learn from each other in many ways and start to create the movement within farming. And I absolutely agree. I think that's critical. And I think that's why it's important to continue to kind of always keep our eye on long-term change and long-term shift and building the evidence and the voices in the public and within the farming sectors, regardless of whether they're currently conventional or organic, to take us towards that whilst being pragmatic and practical, showing you can reverse declines. It is possible to do it on your land, even if perhaps you're a conventional farmer now. There are ways to do it, and let's kind of keep that momentum going. And I think it's vital that we bring in the movement, because you're right. I mean, I've had countless meetings over the past 7 years. I've been working at the RSPB, and now we're in the process of all the member states in Europe deciding how they implement the appalling CAP reform decision we got this year and how to make the best of it. And you know what, on the kind of environmental agenda, we have this much data and evidence on what works, what to do, and virtually everything else there's nothing, or there's evidence showing it doesn't work. There does, I think. Moving forward, we're in a different world now. The last two reforms, we thought we were on a trajectory towards something more enlightened, and I think the last few years have shown that's not the case. And it does feel to me that a wider movement across civil society to communicate with the public about, as Mike says, a different narrative about food and farming together and our countryside, and also with the farming community. And that's quite a tall order, but I think we can only really do it together, to be honest.
Very briefly, it seems to me that the reason why we haven't got the common agricultural policy reforms we needed was because the combined power of informed public opinion to oppose the continuation of the status quo, as Ken Wilson was saying earlier, that is outweighed by the business interest. So that's why, hence the plea of you, because you've got such huge public influence and clout, the national, all the conservation organisations, even in this room, represented by their chief executives, has got the power to shift the understanding of the public, I think, and welfare organisations too.
By the way, we are just fighting very heavily the new, on the horizon coming up, free trade agreement with the United States. This is going to damage environment, absolutely. So we are in Germany on the street already against this one. We don't want our government to get involved. It's a terrible instrument.
A little to the urgency and the process going forward. Are we at a state where we actually have to look on two strategies going parallel? One, working from where we are now, and in the next 5, 10, 15 years, to your point, the last commentator on always thinking long term. But are we already at a point where we have to take what Ruth Richardson talked about, the worst case scenario, and also start there? Sort of saying, what do we have to do now, but also, if we are really facing the worst case scenario, what are the strategies then? And having the interconnection point of those two strategies really informing each other. I'm a little nervous about us continuing the good work we are doing here without having the worst case scenario with us and already in mind.
Well, actually, all we are doing is that the worst case scenario will never happen. That's all what we are trying to do. Okay, I leave two more, Patrick, and then we have to.
Yes.
Yeah.
10 past we need to be. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we have a coffee break.
Thank you. My name is Joris Lohman. I'm the representative of the Slow Food Youth Network. And we form a network of young professionals in food, interdisciplinary, so combining chefs with farmers, people that work in retail processing. And I'm pretty hopeful about the new generation. It's been talked about a couple of times before this afternoon. And I think that one of the things that's most important to make this connection between the city people and the food professionals of the future and the farmers. And in our work, we really try to work not only with the organic, cuddly, nice farmers that we would like to see in the city, but most importantly also with young, big farmers organizations, conventional farmers. And I think that building this network, this interdisciplinary network, is something we really try to create a core group of change agents that will be the decision makers of the future. We've been pretty successful in the Netherlands, and we're trying to do that in other countries as well. And one of the most important things or interesting things when I attend a meeting like this with very, let's say, influential people, directors, people of research, that most of the times when we're looking at solutions, we're pointing to the younger generation. And I think, well, I'm very happy with that. But I'm also looking for, because I really believe in the work that we're doing, but I also sometimes feel frustrated about the impact that we're having, and it's not really a question that I have, it's just an open remark. So I'm looking to see how we can also make a better connection between the people that are in power right now and the people that want to make a change from my generation.
Thank you. The last was here, you, and then we have to really wind up.
Thank you. It's Philip Limbury, Compassion in World Farming. I think that this conference really strikes at the core of what we need to do in putting that, the true value of food that is not being valued in the marketplace there on the shelves. So I also think there needs to be greater transparency if we're going to enable people on the street, if we're going to enable shoppers to get behind the market goods that different farming techniques bring to bear. We need to have that much more clearly identified on the label. The work that I've done shows quite clearly that, for example, the simple term fresh can confuse 30% of the general public and 25% of supermarket managers themselves into thinking, it's true, into thinking that that meat or those eggs came from a free-range situation. So if we want people to really exercise their choice, we have to have transparency in the marketplace, and for my money, that means method of production labeling, which then gives people a better route to knowing what to back with their money. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations, discussion. I think one point is clear. We need to stand close together, I think in a worldwide action, because we have strong people on the other side. Because we talk true cost of food means internalizing external cost also in other businesses. It's not just the farming, it's the industry that supports farming, in quotation marks. So it's a real struggle. And with regard to information, just one figure, in Germany, food industry spends €13.83 per person per year on their information to make sure we buy more than we need and throw it away. And the government, let's say that would be a neutral information, is 6 cents. So you see where the power is with regard to information. We need a lot to do, and I would like to have maybe a day, we have to create a day where everywhere in the world at the same day something is happening to make people aware of the situation, that it becomes clear, because the tendency is that people say, okay, I have really less waste, I eat only meat 4 times a week, and now I can fly to the Philippines and have holidays there because I compensated for it. This internal standard we also have to correct. Thank you very much, and we continue. You have a few minutes time.